Today we are going to see the second person or talk about the second person coming into the Indian Renaissance or the social thinking, the contemporary Indian thinkers. He is Lokmanya Tilak. Lokmanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak, that is his full name. He is considered as the Hercules of Indian nationalism. Today we talk a lot about the nationalism, and here we have a person who began that movement, nationalism. He was among those thinkers and leaders of early 20th century who won appreciation from all people due to his love for the country, simplicity and scholarship. His political opponents saw him with jealousy due to his courage to face failures and defeats. The history of his life and work is the history of Western India during the 40 years from 1880 to 1920. It is also the history of the birth and growth of Indian nationalism. The greatest tribute to Lokmanya Tilak was paid by his lifelong political opponent, Gokhale, who is reported to have said that born 120 years before, Tilak would have carved a kingdom for himself. He gave a new turn to Indian political thinking and forced the Indian National Congress to adopt a radical program of fighting for freedom of the country. Thus, Tilak made a unique contribution to national movement for freedom of the country. Bal Gangadhar Tilak was born in Ratnagiri in Mumbai Presidency on 23rd July 1856. The political atmosphere of the country was charged with deep hate, dislike for the new rulers, and exactly after 1 year, it found expression through armed struggle to free the country. The remarkable deeds of grim valor must have impressed the imagination of Bal Gangadhar Tilak as a young child. His father, Gangadhar Pant, was gifted with rare qualities of character and learning. Starting as a teacher, he could not rise beyond the post of deputy education inspector. But Gangadhar Pant decided to give the best possible education to his only son, Bal Gangadhar. After initial education at home, under the loving care of his father, Tilak was sent to school before he was 11. As a student, Tilak proved to be extraordinary in mathematics and Sanskrit and did his matriculation in 1872. He cared more for knowledge than for words, more for thoughts than for the expression, and never took notes in the class. He solved problems of mathematics orally. Tilak pursued his studies in the Deccan College and did his BA with first class in 1876 and his LLB in 1879. It is said that at the sight of disease, old age and death took away the smile from the face of Gautama Buddha. Renouncing comfortable life of palace and the prospect of kingship, Buddha decided to dedicate his life for the removal of human misery out of compassion. Even as a college student, Tilak had a premonition about his future and ultimate destiny. After passing LLB examination, there were alluring prospects before Tilak of becoming High Court judge and a comfortable life. But like Buddha, he was moved by three events. First, the trial of Malhar Rao Gaikwad by the Special Commission for alleged attempt to poison his resident, Colonel Fire Gaikwad. The Prince of Baroda was innocent. Second, in 1876, an abortive attempt to overthrow British government was made by a band of fanatics under the leadership of Vasudeva Balwant Phadke, a clerk in the government service. Lastly, the terrible famine of 1877 to 78 with a toll of 50 lakhs lives. Tilak spent sleepless nights during those days. Moved by these events, Tilak decided to lead a simple life with a total education to the cause of the poor and service to the country. Tilak's achievements and initiatives. Tilak, with his mind rooted in the rich cultural heritage of India, could see very easily that the system of education introduced by Britishers was only meant to consolidate their power in India. Education of the Western pattern was an attempt to teach people to disbelieve their religion and disrespect their social order. It perverted Indian minds. Tilak felt that education to be useful must be in the hands of the nation's chosen leaders. With these ideas and a strong desire to initiate a movement for national education, Tilak, in cooperation with his friend and fellow student of Deccan College, Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, developed an ambition to establish a network of schools by their initiative to enlighten masses about the condition of their country. As the first step, they took the help of some more people and started a new English school at Pune in January 1880 with 19 students on the roll. Tilak and his colleagues took up the work of teaching at a nominal pay. The school became the center of public life and made remarkable success as a center of education. Tilak thought of setting up a college so that young graduates from the college would help in spreading education through more schools. For that purpose, Deccan Education Society was formed in 1884 to initiate the opening of a college. In 1885, the Ferguson College was established and Tilak worked till 1890 as specialist in maths and Sanskrit. He was the guiding spirit of the institution and did the work of organization and collection of funds. Due to his loyalty and the original ideas of education and service, Tilak developed differences with members of the Deccan Educational Society in 1887 and severed his connection in 1890. He thought of giving more time and attention to the two weekly papers, Kesari in Marathi and Maratha in English, as the editor. So we can see in his life or the achievement a person who has had a vision for the country, a staunch nationalist who began that movement, and he gave, that is, he knew that education was going to be the mainstream, and in order to educate the poor masses, he knew that education had to be in the hands of able leaders, that is the nationalists. Only then it is going to have. Otherwise, the sort of education established by the Britishers, it was only meant for their governance or to make people fit for that job of running the government for them. And Tilak had a vision that the education should involve or should have much more subjects than merely the language. And therefore, with a view of educating or developing, improving the standard of the Indians, he thought of establishing the schools and then a Deccan's Education Society in order to establish a college, so that those who pass out from the school will have further education, and they will be the heralds of bringing about more changes in the society. After his break with the Deccan Society, Tilak joined the Indian National Congress in 1889. The Congress was dominated by moderate leadership, full of praise and admiration for Britishers. Therefore, the road to politics was full of thorns for Tilak. With his burning patriotism, nationalism, and contempt for foreign rulers, the Congress leaders believed in the method of petitions and prayers for securing genuine rights of the people. But the Indian Council Act of 1892 did not satisfy the aspirations of even moderates. Introducing a new thinking, Tilak said, political rights will have to be fought for. Having no faith in the constitutional methods, Tilak said, protests are of no avail. Mere protests not backed by self-reliance will not help the people. Days of protests and prayers are gone. Preaching the message of self-respect, Tilak asked nationalists to rely on the character and capacities of Indian people. He asked people to build their own future through self-effort. So here we will see Tilak as a firebrand, full of nationalism, and he will not tolerate the moderate way of the Congress, the pleasing mentality. Totally it was against his attitude and was not his liking. The moderate leadership of the Congress was one of pleasing, praising and all that. But Tilak wanted a radical way of fighting for one's own right, people's right. The British policies were causing great harm to economic interests of India. Considering the constitutional approach of the Congress as a sign of weakness, the Britishers were doing everything to strengthen their hold on the country. During natural calamities, the attitude of the government was seen to be unsympathetic. Tilak asked the Congress leaders to change their attitude towards the government and educate people about their rights. He said, we must give the best political education possible to the ignorant villagers. We must meet them on terms of equality, teach them their rights and show how to fight it constitutionally. Then only the government will realize that to despise the Congress is to despise the Indian nation. On his part, Tilak remained very active during the epidemic of plague, which took the toll of 1 crore lives. He worked to keep suffering humanity and started a plague hospital to serve the poor people. In utter disregard of his services and cooperation with the government, Tilak was put on trial after the plague was controlled. He was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment for sedition. Tilak spent his term of imprisonment in Yerawada jail as a yogi doing research on the Vedas. So here we see him another phase of his life, that is his joining in the National Congress. He was not in favor of the moderate leadership or the way the Congress was functioning. He wanted something radical to happen. And that's what he was preaching, who was full of patriotism, nationalism. He wanted a way. And he was advocating that we should give the best of education to the ignorant villagers to help them to understand the real situation they are in. Only then they will come out or they will join in the real movement. So for all his work, cooperation with the government, working during the time of the plague, nothing was considered, but he was punished by falsely accusing him of sedition, and for 18 months he was in prison. Now what happened after the prison life? When he was released from the prison, he decided to infuse vigor into the public mind. For this, he organized Ganapati and Shivaji festivals and gradually converted these into social and national force. Now it's very interesting to note why Lokmanya Tilak organized these two festivals and tried to convert them into a national movement. The villagers on those days, it was very hard for them to be gathered for any function. But these festivals were the good occasion for them to come together, and Lokmanya Tilak found that that was the best way to organize and get them together and to educate them. And therefore later on these festivals, that is of Ganapati festivals and that of Shivaji festivals, were converted into a social and national force. Tilak thought of gathering patriotic and national forces around the personality of Shivaji. But unfortunately, Tilak could not convince the moderate leadership of the Congress about the validity of his actions. Between 1898 to 1904, Tilak could not make much contribution to the public life due to his preoccupation with litigation. So there was another force trying to defame him, try to curtail him in number of ways so that he will not come up in as a leader or his contribution to the nationalism. In 1905, Lord Curzon declared partition of Bengal. It was now very clear to everybody that Britishers had nothing good to offer, and the Congress policy of fighting through constitutional means had lost its relevance. Tilak and some other congressmen like Aurobindo, B.C. Pal, Lajpat Raj voiced their opposition to the policy of the Congress leaders and threatened to open revolt. This was the year Tilak emerged as a national leader, an upcoming champion of Swaraj. He asked the nation to get prepared for decisive struggle for freedom and reminded people that path of duty is never sprinkled with rose water, nor do roses grow on it. He made it clear to the people he made it clear that the people would make necessary sacrifice for realization of their goal. Forging alliance with the radicals of the Congress, Tilak made a whirlwind tour of the country and asked people to support extremists for liberation. In 1907, an open clash took place between the moderates and the extremists at the Surat mission of the Surat session of the Congress. With the spirit of cooperation and for the sake of higher ideals, Tilak offered to compromise if the Congress agreed to work for Swaraj, Swadeshi, boycott and national education. This was the proof of his greatness. Due to obstinacy of the moderates, the break of Congress could not be averted. So here we can see the step or the contribution made by Tilak. Tilak wanted the Congress leadership to be little more radical, little more assertive than going through the moderate way. He was so much so, Tilak even thought of joining hands with the extremists in order to make this movement something very radical. And he exhorted people to support the extremists' idea of the liberation. And he went about touring through all the villages, through his organizing people, through his speeches, writings. He had 2 dailies, one is in Marathi and one in English, asking people or conveying his ideas about nationalism, the plight of their own country, the countrymen, what we are having under the British rule or how we are being exploited by the British rulers. His sole concern was to make the people aware, self-assertion, and the only way they will be able to really rise against the situation. Tilak was branded as the evil genius of the Congress, always creating trouble. But the history of modern India has to acknowledge the attitude of Tilak and his fights for radical approach in the policies and programs of the Congress, which brought a change in the history of the nationalist movement and ultimately made Congress a really effective body to fight for freedom for the country. Tilak never asked for any reward of his services and only suffered for humanistic ideals. In 1908, Tilak was put to trial by the Bombay High Court for writing an article alleged to be seditious. He was sentenced to 6 years or transportation to Mandalay jail, where he was kept in solitary room. On his return from Burma, after completing the terms of imprisonment, Tilak thought of organizing the people to demand home rule. As he was out of Congress, Tilak also thought over the question of re-entry into extremists into Congress. In the political career of Tilak, the year 1916 was important for 2 reasons. He joined his old comrades at Lucknow session of the Congress, and secondly, he formed Indian Home Rule League with the object of attaining self-government for Indian people within the British Empire by constitutional means. So we can see here what is happening. A man never dissuaded by the punishment. First he had 6 years of imprisonment, 18 months of imprisonment, then followed by 6 years of imprisonment, and nothing could deter his spirit. He was all the more vigorant and all the more enthusiastic about the prospect of having the home rule, nationalism, going and meeting the people, making them through his speeches and writing, again undertaking, making them aware of the situation. Tilak undertook an extensive tour of the country propagating favor of home rule. By 1917, the extremists took complete control of the National Congress. Tilak went to England in 1918 to represent the country demanding home rule and made a great impact on English public opinion through his writings and speeches. In a letter to an Englishman, Tilak wrote, "It is necessary for me to dwell upon the imperative importance of solving the Indian question for purposes of ensuring the future peace of world and the progress of the people of India." The Home Rule movement launched by Tilak was the natural culmination of the nationalist movement. The call for Swadeshi movement, for Swaraj, had been gathering force since the partition of Bengal in 1905. The Home Rule movement marked a new important phase in the struggle for independence. It placed before the Congress a concrete program of action and the scheme of self-government. During 1916 to 17, Tilak was at the height of his political life and was admired by the whole country for his sincerity. Any problem? Unbending patriotism and fearlessness. Tilak fought for political ideal with a religious zeal, never compromising on principles. The mass movement in the political field, which Tilak initiated, worked a miracle in the hands of Gandhi after the death of Tilak in 1920. So here we see how Tilak is trying to bring about that the ideal of nationalism and the home rule, Swaraj, and such ideals, or his speeches, fiery speeches, had a great impact on the people, and he was gathering them for that movement of asking for that home rule, the Swaraj, independence and all that. All this got culminated during the 1916-17. Tilak was at the height of his political life and was admired by the whole country for his sincerity. He had no great ambition of occupying an important role or position, nothing. All what he wanted was to make the people aware of the situation and then demand for what is their right, what's the right of the Indians. That was sole concern of Bal Gangadhar Tilak. So he initiated the mass movement in the political field which Tilak initiated, worked a miracle in the hands of Gandhi after the death of Tilak in 1920. Now what shall we consider is that whether Lokmanya Tilak, was he a social reformer? Tilak was not a social reformer in the sense in which Rajaram Mohan Roy is called a social reformer. In the early 19th century, the social reforms of India, mostly educated in Western style of education, thought that Britishers would work for the eradication of evils in the Indian society. The Indian society at that time was ridden with a lot of superstitious practices and abominable things. They considered Britishers as saviors of Indian society. Men like Yamji Renate were eager to get a certificate from Britishers about the equal social status of the Indians. Tilak was a Puritan. He was more fitted to lead the social reforms movement than many of the so-called social reformers. He was a social reformer in the sense that he favored foreign travel, praised remarriages of widows, advocated for female education, opposed untouchability, and condemned discrimination on the basis of castes and creeds. So if we are to consider him as a reformer, then in true spirit he was a reformer because he opposed all these evils existing in the Indian society at that time. So in a way he was more fitted to lead the role of a reform movement than many of the so-called social reformers, because he was a social reformer in the sense that he favored foreign travel, which was a taboo, forbidden for Indians at that time. He praised remarriages of widows. Widows were considered, once the husband dies, they had no other option other than to commit sati or sahagama that was existing. Now, by rule or by law, it was forbidden. Therefore, widows, they had to continue a miserable life. Therefore, he was an advocate for remarriages of widows, advocated female education, which was not heard of, opposed untouchability and condemned discrimination on the basis of castes and creeds. The society was full of that. Tilak wanted genuine reform of the society and not blind imitation of the West. He was a lover of peace, love of Indian culture and tradition, and wanted to reform with respect for Indian tradition. The social reform movement of Tilak's days ignored the basis of Indian society. Tilak wanted social reform movement that would not run counter to the religious and patriotic susceptibilities of the Indian people. He actively participated in social conferences and often moved a resolution to decry lip sympathy for reforms. Tilak said, "All reform grow from within, and unless people are sufficiently prepared by the assimilation of liberal ideas, it is useless to march ahead." Tilak was a social reformer. His declaration of sympathy for the poor and the depressed classes was much appreciated, but he was not in favor of a violent social reform. The social reform he advocated one was that from within, through constant or continuous social education, telling the people or making the people aware of what is the real situation. Therefore, only through education there will be a real transformation taking place. So the real change has to come from within. So all other lip service is useless and it will not go much further. Tilak is often charged with having communal approach in organizing Ganesh festival and Shivaji festival. But this charge is not based on proper understanding. Tilak was a nationalist, and the purpose of organizing festivals was to awaken a national spirit. He was immensely proud of the Muslims. He was convinced that this community with its imperialistic traditions had a great future before it. He was certain that a combination of Hindu intellect and the Muslim valor would be irresistible and was bound to bring about the downfall of the British bureaucracy. Tilak was more afraid of Muslim inertia than Muslim opposition. When the Caliphate agitation was launched by Muslim leaders, Tilak offered full support and attended the first Caliphate conference held in Delhi in 1920. Tilak wanted Hindus and Muslims to work together for the common national interests. Maulana Shaukat Ali was one of the pallbearers when Tilak died during the Caliphate movement. Lokmanya Tilak was simple, kind-hearted, dominating, obstinate and ambitious. His entry into public life was just like a dynamic personality appearing in the stagnant waters of our national life. Unlike most educated Indians of his time, Tilak was gifted with more correct perception. He chalked out a new path in public life, deviating from the tendency of the generations of educated Indians, the path of self-sacrifice. His moral and intellectual outlook brought a revolution in the public life of the country. He saw that there could be no social reform without political reform, no national education without national government. In conclusion, we can say Tilak was a man to swim against the current in his life and devoted his life in rousing the moral and intellectual courage of the people. Starting as an opponent of social reform, Tilak lived to count among the great social reformers. His whole life was one long message and source of inspiration to all. Tilak was the idol of people, the molder of national will. The slogan of Swaraj given by him in 1895 was echoed in the Indian National Congress in 1906. The position which he occupied towards the middle of 1928 was the most enviable for any public man in India. Leaving comforts of life, when Tilak threw himself heart and soul in the service of the people, he never looked back. He was a rare combination of politician, statesman, coolness of a philosopher, profundity of a scholar, and a spirit of martyr. Tilak appealed to humanity at large and had ways to say something to mankind was in general, the message of a karma yogi. Thus, we find in Lokmanya Tilak a real firebrand of nationalism. He was a total nationalist, a man totally committed to the service of the nation, his love for his countrymen. That's why even when there was a good chance for him to lead a comfortable life after LLB degree, he could become the High Court judge and a good source of income and a very comfortable life. But there was something within him that disturbed him, and he gave totally himself to the cause of nationalism, Swaraj and the Swadeshi movement. Thus we see the national movement began with Lokmanya Tilak, a man who gave the right spirit into that.